All right, this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 32, Section 2, The End of the Bipolar World. What this section is referring to, this bipolar world, is a reference to the Cold War. So the Cold War was something that really characterized global history from 1945, the end of World War II, all the way until 1989 was when it ended. And so this one is really about how the Cold War ends, this section anyways. For the Soviet Union, there are a number of different crises in the Soviet Union. We kind of already talked about in a couple of the other chapters some of the crises that the Soviet Union faced. The sort of dynamic of the Cold War altered in 1980 when Ronald Reagan was elected president. So we'll say about Ronald Reagan, 1980 US president. And what really made him different from his predecessors, especially Jimmy Carter and Richard Nixon, was he was way more confrontational. More confrontational with the Soviet Union, especially when it came to armaments. Essentially, what Ronald Reagan did was to resume the arms race. Really after the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s with President Kennedy, that was kind of like the high point of tension between the Soviet Union and the United States. After that point, presidents like Nixon, Carter signed treaties to reduce the number of, hydrogen bombs, nuclear missiles, everything else. But Reagan came into power with a much more aggressive attitude. In resuming the arms race, this meant that the Soviets had to spend more money on weapons, and that ultimately put stress on an economy that was already not doing very well to begin with. Like we mentioned in previous chapters, the Soviet system was really bad at providing consumers with what they wanted and putting just even more economic pressure on it by having to build more weapons to match the United States only stressed the economic system even further. Add on top of that, the war in Afghanistan, which was very costly for the Soviets. Eventually, they did have to retreat in 1988. But from 1979 to 1988, the Soviets fought a war in Afghanistan, which cost a lot of money as well. It wasn't successful. It undermined the Soviet system, sometimes referred to as the Vietnam for the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, there were writers Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who were publishing illegal material in the Soviet Union. So we might say this was a critic of the Soviet system. In the Soviet Union, it was government-owned press. They didn't allow for any type of negative press to be had about the Soviets, and so a lot of this material that was being written, again, kind of underground on the black market, circulated very widely. A lot of widespread criticisms not made in the open, but held privately. All of this came to a head when Mikhail Gorbachev was elected premier of the Soviet Union. Soviet premier. The premier is kind of like the president. And probably more than anything else, Mikhail Gorbachev is most responsible. He ruled from 1985 to 1991. Most responsible for the end of the Soviet Union. And what he did, ironically, was try to save it by passing reforms, right? Two reforms, Glasnost and Perestroika. Again, these were reforms to try and save what was already kind of a failing Soviet system. Glasnost was openness, and this was to allow a little, right? Again, a little, quote unquote, free speech. Again, maybe allow for some of the criticisms to be more out there in the open. But once there was the ability to criticize the Soviet system just a little bit, it kind of blew the doors wide open, and pretty soon critics were popping up everywhere. Perestroika was to allow, quote unquote, a little capitalism. And again, the point there is to allow personal ownership, individual ownership, rather than collective ownership. It was very clear by the 1980s, especially even earlier than that, the distinct economic difference between Eastern and Western Europe, the Soviet system and the capitalist system, hoping to allow maybe just a little bit of capitalism. Again, it was very clear which economic system was working properly. And both of these things, rather than saving the Soviet Union from destruction, almost made it even more inevitable, because people became more realizing that these alternatives were better to the system that was already in place. It wasn't in the Soviet Union that the system began to first break away, but rather in the communist bloc. Sometimes we call this the Iron Curtain. Now, in Eastern Europe, there had long been protests. I'm not going to spell Czechoslovakia right. CZ Czechoslovakia. There had long been protests in Eastern European states. In Hungary in 1956, people there tried to push back against the Soviet system. In Czechoslovakia in 1968. Both of these protests were put down by Soviet force, by the Warsaw Pact. Another protest in Poland occurred in 1980, the Solidarity Movement. This was a religious and nationalist and workers' protests against the Soviet system. It was further enforced by the Pope at the time, John Paul II. He was from Poland, so we'll just say Polish Pope. He really kind of gave a face for the Solidarity Movement. And again, a lot of these things were antithetical to the communist system. Religion was something that simply divided the working class. The Soviet Union was a non-religious state. Nationalism, again, was something that divided the working class. The Poles in the Solidarity Movement really emphasized Polish national identity. And, there shouldn't be a point to have a workers' protest, because the Soviet Union represents the interests of the workers. So all these things were frowned upon. However, the only difference is that when the Solidarity Movement in Poland began to challenge the Soviet system, rather than sending in the tanks and crushing the revolt, Mikhail Gorbachev opted not to send in the tanks, and this only allowed for the further disintegration of the Soviet system. Piece by piece, country by country, these nations in Eastern Europe, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, began voting out their communist regimes. A lot of them gave up power. It was only in one country in which, communist rulers were forced out, in Romania. I might call this the only armed overthrow or violent of communist regime. But piece by piece, other Eastern European countries voted out their communist regimes, or peacefully got rid of them, and the Soviet Union essentially stood by and didn't crush it like it did in decades previously. However, the focal point in a lot of ways was Germany. In 1989, people tore down the Berlin Wall. Again, the guards there simply just didn't do anything about it. Here's a picture of it. In a lot of ways, the Berlin Wall was the symbol of the Cold War. It was built between Eastern and Western Berlin inside Germany. Western Berlin, of course, being the side allied with the United States and the British and that side of the Cold War. Eastern Berlin being part of the Soviet system. The Berlin Wall was primarily built to stop people from escaping Eastern Europe and East Berlin, East Germany. Because of the contrast in, the economies, the Western being a lot more better off. And when that wall was torn down, and when the guards there really refused to enforce it, that was a clear sign to the rest of the world that the Cold War was coming to an end. Germany itself, East and West, joined together to create Germany, just not East Germany, not West Germany. This was the first time Germany had been united. I think 1990 was when it occurred. First time Germany had been united since World War II. So after a lot of the Eastern Bloc, or the Iron Curtain nations, broke away, it soon fell onto the Soviet Union, which was also composed of, I think, 13 or 14 different nations, the chief one of them being Russian. Boris Yeltsin, which was the president of Russia, really kind of led the effort to dissolve the Soviet Union. So this was dissolved. The army tried to arrest Mikhail Gorbachev, again, who was premier of the Soviet Union, kind of allowing for a lot of this to take place. That failed, and in the aftermath, the Soviet Union fell apart. It turned into, amongst other countries, the Russian Federation, plus I think 13 or 12 other nations, including Ukraine and some other nations like that. In Yugoslavia, the dissolution of the Soviet Union led to intense violence. In 1991 and in 1999, civil war erupted. And again, a lot of this was based off of nationalism and national fervor. Again, nationalism was something that was really downplayed in communist nations because it was more of a dividing force. But in Yugoslavia, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia also broke apart and became like 6 or 7 different countries, each of these nations having very distinct ethnic identities. And the conflicts in 1991 and 1999 led to ethnic cleansing, which ultimately required intervention from outside powers. NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was created as an anti-communist Cold War alliance, intervened in Yugoslavia to stop the ethnic cleansing. Again, ethnic cleansing being killing people based off of their ethnicity. Cleansing, right? And so if we look at a map here, we can kind of get a better feel for what's going on in this dissolution, how we go from not just the Eastern Bloc or the ending of the Cold War, but really how we see the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So the Eastern Bloc, or the Iron Curtain, those are these nations here. Again, these are the nations in which, following World War II, the Soviet Union installed communist governments. And anytime one of these nations tried to challenge the Soviet system, like in the case of Hungary or Czechoslovakia, the Soviets rolled in the tanks. In 1980, when Poland protested with solidarity, in 1980, no tanks were sent in. And so piece by piece, Poland, Czechoslovakia, which became the Czech Republic, Slovakia, which broke away from Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, they all became independent countries, or they had always been independent countries, but they became non-communist nations. The Soviet Union, you can see in red, was this just monolith of nations, also broke apart into other nations, Russia being chief among them, but Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia got their independence back, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, all these became independent countries, with Russia in a lot of ways serving as the successor state. Here we see Yugoslavia, where the dissolution of the Soviet Union contributed to the breakup of Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia became a bunch of different countries: Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro, Kosovo, and again in 1991 and in 1999, warfare in Yugoslavia, ethnic cleansing, and ultimately NATO intervention to put an end to that. So this more or less gives us the modern political makeup of really what Europe is today, and a lot of it has to do with the aftermath of the Cold War. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, if we look really quickly at Africa, Africa following decolonization was plagued by a lot of violence, civil war. Although there was some democratic progress made, especially in the case of South Africa. Nelson Mandela not only was freed from prison, remember Nelson Mandela was part of the African National Congress. South Africa was an apartheid, the IED state, in which only the white citizens there were enjoying any sort of political or economic rights. When Nelson Mandela was freed from prison in 1994, he became the first democratic president. That is a president elected in which everybody of South Africa had the right to vote. Also was the first black president of South Africa. And so that's one example of democracy sort of creeping in, you might say. In other areas, violence continued to be a problem. In Rwanda, a genocide between the Hutus and the Tutsis. The Hutus, two different ethnic groups. The Hutus carrying out a campaign of genocide against the Tutsi population. Here, intervention was slower than Yugoslavia. Again, another instance of ethnic cleansing. But eventually outside powers did intervene, and is certainly a tragedy that occurred there. Meanwhile, there's a question about what role the United States was going to play following following the Cold War. Now that the Cold War is over, really means for the U.S., now what? For a long time, the United States had been active all over the world in terms of preventing the spread of communism and the threat of communism. Saddam Hussein, who was the leader of Iraq, Saddam Hussein believed that the United States would no longer intervene in global affairs. That turned out not to be the case. The example of U.S. intervention through NATO in Yugoslavia is one example. A better example here is the Persian Gulf War. This is a war between the United States and Iraq. Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, eager to capitalize on the country of Kuwait's oil fields. So Kuwait is a oil-rich country. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in an effort to try and get oil. So leader of Iraq invaded Kuwait. And this prompted U.S. intervention, working through the United Nations. George H.W. Bush, president of the U.S., really did a good job of gathering a united effort. The UN approved of this invasion as well. Went to war with Iraq to protect Kuwait. And really following this invasion, including a lot of other predominantly Islamic countries, which also believe that Saddam Hussein was in the wrong here, crushed Saddam Hussein and Iraqi forces, saved Kuwait from Iraqi aggression, and would be in some cases an important event because it proved that the United States, even in the aftermath of the Cold War, was willing to intervene in the globe when it saw fit.